They say that people can be hypnotized under hypnosis, can be given suggestions of false information about themselves, so that when they supposedly come out of hypnosis, they feel that they have false memories. They feel that they remember things that never actually happened. So they say they hypnotize somebody, and then they say, now when you were 5 years old, and you fell off a horse and broke your leg. And then they bring the person out of hypnosis. And when they wake up, this person who has never ridden a horse and never had a broken bone, they'll ask them, they'll say something, like, what happened, anything you remember when you were 5 years old, significant in your memories of being 5 years old? They'll say, oh yeah, I remember I fell off a horse and I broke my leg. And you can take x-rays and verify that this person never had a broken bone, never had a broken leg, and yet supposedly this can happen, that the person will, having had the suggestion implanted, a false memory, they'll actually feel that they remember something never happened. So, presuming that that's possible, it brings into question when somebody says, oh yeah, I remember something, especially when it's something that's been a repressed memory, sometimes for decades. You remember something that you had kept out of your mind, that you hadn't faced trying to think about for decades, and then for some reason at some point it opens up, a little window opens up and the memory comes back to you, and you say, oh my God, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I hadn't thought about this event for 40 years, but suddenly it came back to me. And people will say, well, you're probably just imagining it. That was 40 years ago, and you never thought of it in the last 40 years. And suddenly you say you remember this thing. Well, how do we know that it's not a false memory? How do we know it's not an illusory memory that you think you remember it, but it never happened? Because supposedly there's scientific evidence to verify that people can experience this sense of false memory. And yet, at the same time, at that point it becomes like, well, anytime you say, I remember something, especially if it's something that you hadn't remembered for a long time, and you say, I just suddenly remembered something I hadn't thought of for so long, and I just remembered it. Anytime somebody says this, the person they're saying it to can come back and say, oh, it's probably a false memory. Well, any time somebody remembers, that means that any time somebody remembers something, the counter-argument can be thrown at them that it's probably a false memory. And if that were really true, it would mean that memories are all false. It would mean that we can never believe a memory, that we can never remember something and have the slightest confidence that it could possibly be true, because it's all false memories. And that's just not true. And if it were true, then wouldn't we experience this a whole lot more often? Every single day we say, hey, guess what? I remember being the King of England. Yeah, and you know what else I remember? I remember having $1 billion. Yeah, you know what else? And I remember we would do this constantly, day after day. We would be constantly dragging up false memories, but we don't. It's only once in a while when something actually strikes us. That's the reason we don't remember specific things for decades. There's so many things in our minds, so many things in our lives occupying our thoughts and our attention, that we can't have constant attention for everything in the database of our brains. But that doesn't mean it's not stored somewhere in there if you can find the files. And every once in a while we stumble upon a long forgotten file, and there it is. You click on it and it comes up fresh as new. And there's definitely a difference of the sensation of remembering something compared to just pulling something out of the air and saying, hey, guess what, I remember this. And you know that's not true. But remembering something specific is usually specific, for a specific reason. Pause. Again, there was another branch of this thought I was maybe going to say, and of course it gets, that's another thing about thought. You think one thing, and another thing, another thought. Thoughts are like, sort of like an octopus, and they have at least 8 different directions they can go in. But whichever one you take, it's going to sort of just distract you from going down the other route. So that's what choices are about. Mental choices that we constantly make in our thoughts. Which little lane are we going to turn down? When your mind is like a rotary with maybe a dozen different lanes going off in each direction. Just like this clock you see right here. There's a dozen different markings which direction to go. And it's not as pre-programmed as a clock going only on one predictable course. In our minds, we can take any 12 at any moment. And they lead us in completely different directions.